Hello, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. My name's James Lawrence, one of the business development managers at CTS, and hopefully alongside me you can see my colleague and our CTO, Mohamed Bakeer. Today, we're a presentation on how firms can improve their security posture with endpoint detection and response. In this session, we'll provide some real-life examples of how cyber attacks infiltrate IT systems and how firms can protect themselves and minimize the impact of an attack. This topic is particularly pertinent in the current climate, as I'm sure you can imagine, with the increase in remote working and the rising of cyber threat levels. Just to briefly introduce CTS to those of you who are not familiar with us, we're the legal sector experts when it comes to cloud and security. We work with law firms all across the UK to ensure secure, agile working and drive firms forward through the use of technology. This presentation, unless Mo takes longer, will be around 20 minutes and there'll be an opportunity to ask any questions at the end. So at this point, Mo, it's over to you, unless you've got anything quickly to add before the presentation starts.
Thank you. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the sunny weather today. So I'll start on the presentation. So today we are talking about defending beyond the perimeter and the concept around endpoint security, endpoint detection and response, and the focus around that. As we're all aware, and everybody experienced in their own way over the past 6 to 7 months with COVID-19, remote working really became the only way of working, and it happened all of a sudden. Within a few days, firms had to adapt to their staff working from home. Some firms had an established remote working solutions, but others had to rapidly implement solutions to enable staff to work from home. And I'm sure it was a bit of a challenging time to transition from office-based environment to all staff working remotely. As with these type of situations, the primary focus is always about getting users connected and working and up and running. And normally with that, security kind of takes a little bit of a back step. As firms and their users got familiar with working remotely and on a long-term basis and then adapted to that, I think now that potentially the force is shifting to this hybrid model of working. We don't know yet, depending on what happens, but security is becoming a priority to address the rise of risks around security that are presented by remote working. We're here today to discuss the security risks introduced, in some cases amplified in instances by remote working, which is becoming the mainstream option. So the rise and risk of remote working. One of the key elements around this is the traditional office-centric network security. And what I mean by that is traditionally firms of all sizes have, in a way, when working in the office, devices are often subject to a number of different security controls designed around the office network, including network firewalls, intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems, web filtering and the like. When working remotely, unless the users are connected back to the office through VPN or utilizing some kind of secure gateway solution, they are suddenly far more exposed than they were before and are more susceptible to phishing, malware attacks and attempts of compromise. It is important that organizations begin to adopt an approach that sees security controls deployed to end user devices or as close to them as possible, considering the type of work environment that we all having to adopt now and potentially going forward. The second element around, or the second symptom of rising security risk from working remotely is around bring your own device. So with organizations and firms getting their users to work from home, what we have seen some firms that have users working using their own personal devices to connect back to the firm's systems and applications. And with that, this introduces some challenges around mainly lack of management control. So the provisions and the policies and device controls that firm would typically have on corporate issued devices. It's not the same level as employees' personal devices. That presents constraints in enforcing the firm's device policies, and usually the policies are more around the do's and don'ts as opposed to having the validation and enforcement element. So, i.e., the firm would say that users need to ensure that their device is protected with an antivirus, that it's kept up to date, and so on. But usually there are no means of enforcing that or validating that that's the case unless the firm is using some advanced endpoint validation or filtering before connections are allowed. But that exposes the idea around the maturity of the endpoint protection, i.e. antivirus or next-gen antivirus deployed on the personal devices, and presents the IT team with lack of visibility around these end-user devices. The third element around remote working is unsecured Wi-Fi networks. So at varying degrees, usually home Wi-Fi tends to be set to default manufacturer passwords or login details, which are potentially easy for a hacker to identify. For the non-IT users, they might be using default weak authentication mechanisms for Wi-Fi. So we call them WEP instead of more advanced, more strong authentication, such as WPA2 around the length of characters for a Wi-Fi password and so on. So it's easier for a hacker to gain access to a Wi-Fi network and from there start attempt to access devices. Users normally get a message when connecting to a Wi-Fi network asking whether they want their machine to be visible on that Wi-Fi network, and by clicking yes, and if that's mixed with a non-hardened Windows firewall rules, for example, that allow access to file sharing protocol file shares, that opens quite a big gap for a hacker to attempt to compromise that device. And this increases the risk of compromise, which starts with the remote end user device and potentially makes its way through the firm's network. The other symptoms around increase in phishing attacks, and from a hacker's perspective, the rapid speed of adopting remote working for firms and having to focus on facilitating that, attackers are trying to tap into that vulnerability. And we have seen a significant rise in phishing attacks and malware attacks, particularly phishing attacks, in the past several months. I know of a particular firm that had few phishing attacks within a period of 2 months. Usually, compromised symptoms tend to be somewhere around new programs that are installed on the user device, that appear on the user device, and users might be quite uncertain around those applications, and they might be thinking that as part of this whole agile remote working, that corporate IT are deploying additional applications for them. Computer might be slowing down. Users might see strange pop-ups appear on their screen, or in worst case, lose control over mouse or keyboard. That's before an attacker compromises credentials or gains access to data and information. Remote access for users is another element, which is normal utilization of legacy hardware-based VPN solutions. Legacy VPN solutions, which lacks advanced policy controls and enforcement of protection. So it tends to have basic policy settings around traffic rules and network controls, but lacks that advanced software-based application controls. And firms really should adopt a modern software-based remote access solution, preferably with conditional access and joined with multi-factor authentication to enhance that security for remote access. And then another element is around insecure or weak passwords, and users tend to use similar passwords or the same password for their personal accounts and work purposes. And if a personal account, for example, is compromised, then it's potentially relatively easy for an attacker to gain access to users' work credentials and start infiltrating the network from there. I thought that we provide two real-world examples really of the type of attacks and how they manifest themselves for users. So we have two examples here. The first one is for Henry. Henry is a practice manager at a conveyancing firm, and he has been a victim of malware attack. An example attack like this would start with a spear phishing email, which would carry a malicious attachment, let's say an Excel attachment. And that Excel attachment file would contain a malicious macro within that file. And when that's enabled, it runs a script that downloads and runs an executable aimed at stealing credentials, spying on Henry's device camera, and gaining access to information. The organization's antivirus solution did not detect the Excel file or its behavior in the way that an endpoint detection and response solution would do that. So if Henry's got EDR software deployed on his device, the EDR software would block the download of the document and would stop the execution of that code that would give the attacker compromise. In addition to that automated blocking of the execution, the EDR solution would report an alert within the management interface, so security teams or the IT teams are aware and can take steps to further harden the security and apply additional policies to prevent this from happening. If Henry's machine has been compromised, potentially the attacker would gain access to his credentials and execute a man-in-the-middle attack, and that could potentially present itself in transfer of financial funds into bank accounts that the hacker has instead of a client or the firm's bank account in that case. And we've seen real examples of this taking place. The second example that I wanted to provide is around, in this case, Sue. Sue is a litigation lawyer in a corporate firm. She's been a victim of a phishing attack. In this case, Sue receives an email from Microsoft notifying her that she needs to reset her email password as it's due to expire. Sue then clicks through to the Microsoft website and types in her login details. All of a sudden, the page refreshes and Sue completes the action again, assuming that the refresh of the page is caused by some kind of a connectivity issue. In this example, the email was not genuine, and Sue doesn't know she typed her credential into a fake website, and she was not alerted to the risk, as she was then redirected to the actual Microsoft site following her credentials input. The hacker now has her details and can use this to log into the firm's systems without triggering any alarms, because it is he or she are using Sue's legitimate credentials. At this point, they can attempt to elevate their privileges or move horizontally to other systems that are connected on the network. The hacker in this example was able to gain access to sensitive information on a corporate acquisition case that Sue was working on. With traditional defenses, nobody at the firm would be any the wiser until the hacker reveals themselves, potentially by locking down the firm's systems or holding them to ransom until they paid to have their systems back. This has significant implications to the firm for the sensitivity of the information that's been compromised and causes a reputation or client relationship damage for that particular client. These type of attacks are particularly on the rise, and the risk is amplified by remote working models when security controls and end-to-end protection and detection is not in place. So what this means to firms in that case. So the first point is our preventative measures don't ensure 100% protection. Traditional preventative measures which historically centered around perimeter protection, i.e. the perimeter of the network, and endpoint protection in the cases of antivirus or next-gen antivirus deployed on user devices. That in itself don't guarantee or ensure 100% protection. It doesn't address fully the security risks associated with remote agile working and BYOD devices. In the event of a compromise, hackers are able to remain inside the network for weeks, if not months, and while the firm might instruct users to reset their passwords in the event that a compromise of a user is identified, if the hacker has already made his or her way into the network and in listening observing mode, they would easily be able to execute further compromises and credential theft. Firms don't have the end-to-end capabilities to address these threats without without being equipped with rapid detection and response tools that extend from the corporate network, the back-end infrastructure, into the end user devices in this case. And remediation or reactive remediation in this case following a compromise could be very time consuming and costly, and sometimes impossible to recover from the damage that it caused depending on the level of compromise that took place in that case. So what is the solution? I mean, security is a wide topic that involves a lot of components. But in this particular instance, we're focusing around the endpoint detection and response. So endpoint detection and response, or EDR, continuously monitors endpoint devices, such as users' laptops and mobile devices, to respond to advanced threats and protect your firm against malicious cyber attacks. It provides detection of suspicious activity, which is the D part of the EDR. And that's really around the behavior or the difference between an EDR solution and a typical antivirus solution, which I will cover in a further slide. It provides automated blocking and containment of malicious activities. So there's a certain level of automation or programmability that can be applied to an EDR solution that takes immediate actions upon detection of a vulnerability or a sign of a compromise. In addition to that immediate automated blocking, it's around performing alert triage and filtering, and typically traditional solutions would alert on a lot of events that have taken place, and IT then having to scroll through a lot of white noise alerts. The intelligence around an EDR solution is performing that triage of alerting and only highlighting alerts that needs to be addressed, or for your information purposes around events that took place, and the fact that EDR solution have blocked these attempts of compromise. Also, in the event of an issue, an EDR solution would aid in search and automated searches and investigation of data, forensics, investigation around the breach, and tracking the events that took place from start to finish, and determining where the weak points are to be able to apply additional controls or policies or restrictions to remediate against a similar event in the future. It also provides visibility into all endpoints and connections between them. So it detects issues within a device, but also through that device communicating with other devices, it extends horizontally into the wider network. And in the event that a device is suspected to have communicated with another device, and that device has been identified as a compromised, an EDR solution would perform automated actions such as disconnecting that particular device from the network by disabling the network adapter or the Wi-Fi adapter in that case, to prevent propagation of risk into other devices. And this point is around integration with other tools as a force multiplier. What I mean by that is EDR integrates with your antivirus endpoint protection solution, with your network protection tools, with your firewall tools to enhance that security posture and strengthens the firm's capability around the detection of any vulnerabilities and risks beyond the individual security components and what they do for the individual application, in this case an antivirus or a firewall or a web filtering solution or an email filtering solution, etc. And to kind of present this in terms of the journey that some of the firms are on, firms with no EDR solution in place would typically be reliant on prevention, but what about the 1% that slips through, that manages to make its way through? And 1% from a security gap could cause the same damage as a higher percent in that case. Go to the next level beyond that, which is the implementation of limited EDR capabilities, and that's more of a dumb collection. If we go back to the previous slide when I was talking about the level of alerts that a traditional solution would create, and IT having to go through all these alerts to find the ones that are relevant that needs to be addressed. This approach, where the burden is on the user to search and find meaningful detection with limited response tools at hand. Then we move into intelligent EDR, which has native automation capabilities, prioritizes alerts, and performs the alert triage, and can prevent with automated actions if needed, while also giving the security teams the flexibility to performing their own custom searches or application of enhanced policies on the network. But this still requires the existence of a security team of some form, depending on the size of the firm. And then at top of the maturity really is having a managed detection and response EDR solution that provides proactive managed hunting, investigation, and rapid response activity on emerging threats. This leverages the rich data using analytics and having a dedicated SOC team that delivers that service. Traditionally, an intelligent EDR solution would be a cloud-based solution, and that kind of takes us into the difference between endpoint detection and response and endpoint protection, including next-gen endpoint antivirus. EDR is often contrasted with antivirus programs or with endpoint protection platforms, which are umbrella offerings that integrate antivirus anti-malware capabilities with other familiar security tools, such as data encryption, firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, and so on. The tools that make up the endpoint protection tend to be preventative in nature and are signature-based. What I mean by that the antivirus software would have a database of known viruses, malwares, and so on, and it would rely on that database to protect against any virus or malware that exists in that database that is identified on the user device. A typical antivirus then would get regular updates to that database as additional malware or viruses are known. This means that matching the potential threat against a database of known malicious code in order to stop an attack before its execution. But as threats grow more nimble, this sort of defense, which depends on a static library of known threats, viruses, malware, and so on, and the firm perimeter defense grows less effective, and that's where ADR really comes in. All the action happening on endpoints, from configuration changes to processes launched by the user or otherwise, or killed, to be files being accessed, copied, or exfiltrated, is really the meat of hacker operation. And ADR platforms aim to provide a front row seat really for security staff, along with certain degree of automated response. EDR platforms generally consist of agents deployed on end user devices those agents monitor the activity and send information back to a centralized server. That server could be on-premise in some of the EDR implementations, but preferably a cloud-based. The server then can automatically detect problems and attempt to correct them or alert a security team. It also serves information via dashboards monitored by typically InfoSoc teams within the business. I think as I'm coming to an end, really, I'll be keen to get feedback or answer any questions that any of you may have on the topic discussed. I'll hand back to James.
Yeah, we have actually had a couple of questions submitted already. So if there are any others, there should be a question box on the right-hand side for you to fill them in. But while we're waiting, Mo, so first question, would you expect to see any impact on the endpoints in terms of latency after installing this type of solution?
Not to any different really from a typical endpoint monitoring agent. So there is a resource consumption on the endpoint, but that's within the typical use cases of deploying an antivirus or another monitoring agent on the end user device. So you wouldn't see any performance issues that would affect the device or the user's operation.
Okay, and then next one is asked, if I have email security in place and that appears to be working, why would I also need to implement any kind of EDR?
That's a good question. So I think the idea around EDR and sometimes joined with what we call MDR, which is managed detection and response, is really collecting the information from these individual standalone systems that provide a level of protection for a particular component. So in the case of an email filtering solution, that solution would typically be centered around email security, but it wouldn't cover other aspects of security that needs to be addressed. An EDR solution adds that layer of intelligence to collect information from the email filtering solution, from a web filtering solution, from other systems of security, and act as an aggregator of that data, and then performing analysis and cross-correlation between these systems to deliver that strength and security and the ability to detect malicious activity much quicker than any standalone system can do.
Okay, and then final one currently, Mo. Would there be any compatibility issues if you have this installed alongside a different endpoint protection provider, such as Symantec?
Yes, so EDR providers, in terms of EDR software that is available in the market, if we talk about the top ranked providers around that, they would typically offer two separate solutions. In that case, an EDR only tool or an EDR joined with a endpoint protection tool. In the case that a firm would already have an endpoint protection in place, the EDR solution would work with that endpoint protection. There are no compatibility issues because the EDR solution is picking up the information from whatever the antivirus solution is that records in its logs or live logs and performs the analysis on that information. So we typically see examples of an EDR agent deployed alongside a different antivirus solution in that case.
That's great. Thanks, folks. So that was all the questions that I think we've got at the moment, unless anyone has anything to add in. Finally, again, I think that's pretty much the half an hour, Mo. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. If anyone has any kind of follow-up questions or would like a copy of the webinar, we're happy to get those across to you. But if there's nothing else, I think that concludes the half an hour. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
Just from me, James, sorry. So I've tried really to keep the session at kind of high level and didn't want to be too technical. But if anyone of the attendees needs a deep dive into this topic and wants to discuss, I'm happy to facilitate that in due course.
Perfect. Yeah. So anyone who wants further information can get in touch, and we can do all we can to go into a bit more detail. Perfect, that's great. So that's it. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Mo, and
Thanks.
hopefully we'll soon.
Cheers. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.